our tactical objectives and kind of really determine how the missions were run to accommodate the bigger picture, and that was cool. It gave us a lot of opportunity to do things outside the box, I guess you could say. And got to do some pretty cool stuff that I definitely wouldn't have been allowed to do in the U.S. military. So that was really rewarding, yeah. But
Hello, this is an interview on Armia TV. My name is Leonid Matsievsky, and today we are talking to a very interesting person. His name is Seabrook Murray George, and he is a member of the International Legion of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. Hello, I am very glad to see you in our studio.
Hi. Nice to be here, thank you.
For me, this is the first experience when I have to talk with the help of an interpreter, but this is already the second interview of such kind on Armia TV. Earlier, we invited your brother-in-arms, John, who used to serve in the U.S. Marine Corps. In fact, that was a very cool video, and it is really nice that we have such a continuation with your unit. I would like to start with the topic which, as for me, is most captivating. I am 26 years old now. I joined the Armed Forces of Ukraine in 2022. I had a clear motivation why I had joined. Because in the 20th century, my grandfathers, my ancestors, relatives, my family were destroyed by the Soviet regime. Many of my relatives died of starvation in the Holodomor of 1933. At that time, communism took the lives of a lot of my relatives. In 2014, I saw that Russia wanted to bring it back to my country. That is why I joined the Armed Forces of Ukraine. I fought in an assault brigade. I was wounded too. As far as I know, you were born in Great Britain and served in the United States. What is this war for you? And why did you decide to join it and fight for the good here?
Yeah, I think that's a relatively easy question for me to answer. For myself, I don't have a lengthy, I don't have any military tradition in my family. So being a soldier and establishing that military tradition within my family line was always really important to me. This is my profession. It's what I want to do throughout my life. And so I've always sought for, I don't want to say I'm a very idealistic person, but like the cause that I'm fighting for, the reasons that I do something have to make sense to me, right? And so with the war in Ukraine, it's always been a very clear-cut case of what the right and wrong sides here. And I have made the decision to choose to fight on the side of what's right. And so, there's so much stuff that I saw in the beginning of the war, like you mentioned, like the war since the beginning of 2014, and then the things that we saw happening later on. That made it very easy for me to make that decision that, okay, coming over to Ukraine, the Zelensky's call for military professionals with certain skill sets and whatnot, that made it simpler for me to find my place here, absolutely. But my overall decision was okay, this is a just and right thing to do and a right cause to get behind. So it's easy to be here for that reason.
I'm very happy to hear that. Because I understand that now, in society, in the world, there are people who are kind of a caste of warriors, I guess. And that's very cool because it's a fight for really good convictions and good goals. And that's very responsible, in my opinion. That's why I'm very grateful to you for your decision. When President Zelensky addressed people with combat experience, we really needed that. When did you first hear about the war in Ukraine?
So I've been following the war since 2014. I think that, but back in 2014, I was just a couple years out of the military, a pretty young dude still, trying to establish like a civilian life post-military. So it wasn't necessarily like something, and at that point, I will admit that Ukraine was a rather like ephemeral thing to me. Like I didn't really wasn't very familiar with the concept of Ukraine and how that is a separate entity from Russia and the USSR notion of like the eastern states. So I wasn't too informed or educated about Ukraine as an independent nation. So it was easy for me to see what was going on in the media, but just be like, oh, look, it's, and I hate to say this, but it's at that point in my life, it was like, okay, this is another war halfway across the globe. It is interesting because I'm a military professional, but it didn't like rapidly grab my attention as much as it could have. But as time went on, I educated myself with what was going on over here, what happened, how the lines were drawn after the 2014 invasion, and what the ramifications of that invasion were for Ukraine, the rapid modernization of Ukrainian military that came about after 2014, the multiple different countries that were helping, be it with training with their forces and whatnot going forwards. That kind of kept it in my sphere of interest. And so as I'm sure you do yourself as a military guy, I'm always interested in military news and what's going on in the military world at large, right? So continuing to stay on top of that, especially with the buildup of forces for the recent invasion, that kind of made it, there was a lot of, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Watching all of that was easier for me to stay on top of it.
As for this interview, we're also publishing its English version. And with the previous interview, we did the same thing. And to my pleasant surprise, the English version even has got a little more views than the Ukrainian one. There are already about 100,000 views, and a lot of Americans are coming in the comments, and we've actually received a lot of support. I'm interested in your opinion in this context. Suppose, in this war, in a manner of speaking, the forces of good either lose or fail to bring it to an end. What could be the consequences?
That's an excellent question. And I think that's something that crosses everybody's mind. It definitely crosses my mind, what happens if we are not successful in this? I know that I have no plans of going anywhere. If the situation does turn bad, so be it. We'll continue to fight and do our jobs. But the ongoing ramifications from that could be massive. I think that as we previously saw, and I think there's no illusion that Russia's intent was to take Kyiv in 3 days and then continue pushing westward. We would, in my opinion, we would likely see a buildup of Western or Russian troops on the western borders of Poland and Moldova, along, build up more in Transnistria, with an intent to continue to push Russian sovereignty further west as it goes. Their rhetoric coming out of their media very much states that is what their intent is. Whether or not they're capable of that is an entirely different question, but I believe that would be their intent were they to win the war in Ukraine. However, I think that before that were able to happen, we would see this spread into a much larger global war at that point because there is so much invested in Ukraine. And while the Western states currently are hesitant to commit manpower, much resources have been committed, and it will get to that point where if Ukraine was clearly going to lose the war and it was going in a bad way here, then we would probably see a very large buildup of troops in the Western countries that are bordering Ukraine, start to see more of a solidification of the borders there and a preparation for what's to come potentially.
I would like to share my opinion, which is usually not accepted in interviews, but I would like to say that if the Western countries, including the US, keep an eye on us, Ukrainians will continue to fight, come what may. And we have proven this historically. And I am confident in my people, in this particular case, and in the people who are fighting for this country, Even in the worst-case scenarios, we have always continued to fight, even by guerrilla methods. However, under the circumstances, despite the fact that some people may find certain success of the Russians to be quite serious, it's true, they have a lot of certain success. But in any case, they are not the same as they used to be historically in our situations, for example, in the last century, when the Ukrainian People's Republic had been strangled by the Russian troops. And I think that we still have the greatest chance, so to speak, to consolidate the Ukrainian state so that the horrors of the 20th century may not happen again. You are now serving in the International Legion of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. What is your function now? What tasks do you perform? What is your position? And what do you namely do?
I'm part of 1st Squadron of the International Legion Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. I was previously a team leader of a section of guys within there. I am currently now a company commander for a group of teams that have come together and formed a company. We found that we could better pool our resources, better pool our manpower, and support each other by moving forwards as one larger unit. So that's what we have done. And I was elected into the position of company commander of that. So currently most of my tasks revolve around preparing that for work and setting up everything. But in terms of like our general tasking, we work as specialized infantry in a lot of ways. We don't necessarily have the manpower to do a lot of like general infantry tasks ourselves. However, we have found with our specialization and the skill sets that our men bring to the field, we are able to bolster other Ukrainian units and support them in ways that they don't necessarily have within them, organic to themselves. So for example, we have some fantastic javelin gunners. If we are able to come to a sector of the front, Ukrainian military or ZSU unit that we're working with doesn't have anti-tank capabilities, not a problem. We can send over a team of dudes to occupy a position with them if they have threat, if there's a lot of tanks operating in their sector. We've done that previously, like in Donetsk, for example. We had a ZSU unit contact us, and they said, look, we've got these 3 tanks that keep rolling around this town harassing us, and we don't have the anti-tank capability to do anything about it. We've got the infantry side of things, we're doing great there, but we need someone to handle these tanks for us. Okay, we went in and we worked with those guys. And that's just one of the examples of how we can help out. Other ways is like doing more specialized infantry work in terms of like raid capabilities and things. Some of our guys offer a different mindset when it comes to like planning and the potential use of forces. So with that in mind, we can look at things from another angle where one commander who's holding down a region, he says, look, I have this tactical objective, but I am failing to see a way to accomplish it with the strengths and the men that I have or the resources I have available to me. Can you guys bring in another way of thinking on this? And we've been able to be helpful with that. Just bring, I guess, I hate to say, but that like Western mindset to some things. There's one way of military thinking, and then there's a different way of military thinking. And I find that our unit has done a fantastic job of like hybridizing the Eastern and Western military mindsets and bringing them together. We have commanders who understand how ZSU units work, and then we have our personnel who understand how the Western military works. And through good conversation, we figure out a solution that's going to be the best of both worlds, and maybe something, like I said, that the Ukrainian commanders were coordinating with haven't thought of previously. And if they're happy with our suggestion, then we try to make that happen.
It's cool, really. Do you possibly remember your first battles in Ukraine? Maybe you could share your memories about them?
Yeah. I've done quite a lot in Ukraine. I've been all over. When I first started working in Ukraine, it was around Kramatorsk in that region. So like Slavyansk and that area was the first time I got into contact with Russian forces working out there. And then we moved down and worked in Kherson pretty heavily, or not, wouldn't say pretty heavily, but for a bit there. Did some really good work in Kherson around the time of the counteroffensive there. That was some of the most fulfilling and satisfying work I've done in Ukraine, just because we had a lot of freedom at that time. And we were allowed to come up with creative ways to achieve our tactical objectives and kind of really determine how the missions were run to accommodate the bigger picture, and that was cool. It gave us a lot of opportunity to do things outside the box, I guess you could say. Got to do some pretty cool stuff that I definitely wouldn't have been allowed to do in the U.S. military. So that was really rewarding. Yeah, but then I've been in some really tough places too. Bakhmut was worked there quite a bit, did multiple rotations there. Had some good experiences there. I like working within the city. Had some horrible experiences working in the woodblocks outside of Bakhmut. Not a super cool place to work at the time I was there. The Russians were super aggressive and definitely had the upper hand in terms of like artillery and set up positions, prepared positions, but it's not always going to be that you work in good places, right? So, yeah.
Артилерія – це сильна сторона росіян, насправді.
Artillery is indeed one of the strengths of the Russians.
Не так точність цієї артилерії.
Especially back in 2022, I remember it wasn't so much the accuracy of their artillery as the sheer quantity and scale of their operations.
Якщо нейтрально подивитися,
What could you say?
росіян як на
Looking in an unbiased way at the Russians as soldiers, as opponents you have to fight against.
Тому що в мене є певний досвід.
Because I have some experience with them myself.
Ми, наприклад, зазвичай своїм
For example, our unit usually tried to avoid direct engagements, direct firefights, and instead acted in ways that made the enemy retreat. Using the accuracy of our artillery and proper fire adjustments,
такі методи, щоб їх максимально залякати.
we applied some methods to intimidate them as much as possible.
В Харківській області.
I recall one specific operation in the Kharkiv region during the Kharkiv counteroffensive. We positioned ourselves at a certain distance from the Russians. They hadn't detected us yet, but we had spotted them. Using the tank fire adjustment, we managed to destroy several of their combat vehicles, which were camouflaged in a forest strip.
Така, там, точність вогню певною мірою і їхня...
That precision fire, combined with their fear, literally made them open fire into the air in the morning and abandon their positions in panic.
Ми намагалися таким якимось чином діяти, але...
But it was much more difficult when we were in direct engagements. In such cases, you have to stake your life on, because these situations can always be highly unpredictable, especially when it comes to direct firefights. What would you say about the enemy? Based on your experience, how do the Russians fight?
Yeah, I very much agree with what you said about correcting fires and working almost as like a forward observer as a preferable role to, say, doing a frontal assault on a fortified enemy position. I think that is how this war has gone about has turned into that war of attrition, right? In a lot of ways, with prepared positions. Entrenchment is in many ways the name of the game. Maneuver warfare is very, very hard to accomplish out here, given the landscape and then the number of prepared positions, how they have both sides are established with defense in depth. You're not just talking about attacking a prepared position that's an individual position on its own. It's almost guaranteed that that position will have rearward positions covering it with their arcs of fire, and then positions to the left and right that you have to be concerned about. So it's not as simple as saying, hey, I'm just going to do a frontal assault on this one building or objective. You have to worry about how that ties into the bigger picture. And like you said, it's a very scary proposition, having your commander tell you, hey, well, you're going to do a forward assault or a frontal assault on this objective. We try to, I wouldn't say that we shy away from doing assaults, because at some point you eventually do have to take that position, right? Like, someone has to go to that position and clear it themselves. And so we try to develop the individuals who show the characteristics and the traits and the desire to do that kind of work. We try to develop them and support them so that we have a group of guys that we can trust to go and do that. The worst thing that we can have happen is send out a group of guys and then they get halfway there and they're like, no, we can't do this, and come back, right? Like, that achieves nothing. It just puts dudes in harm's way and risks them. But I do think with how this warfare has gone, what you were saying about like correcting fires and working as forward observers for artillery or drones or tank fires is how we win in a war of attrition, where one side has the numerical superiority on Russia's side, obviously, and a significant disregard for the cost of life as well. Russia is happy to throw manpower at an issue, and they do not care if their men come back. However, we can't afford to operate like that, nor have I seen that any or very many Ukrainian commanders, if any, are willing to risk their men in that kind of way because they value their lives differently, which I'm very happy to see. And so how do we win in a war where we value lives and the enemy doesn't, and they have the numbers on their side? We do exactly what you're saying. We use our technological advantage, right? And that's, if it be it artillery that has better accuracy or better volume, well, maybe not volume of fire, but accuracy is the big one, better types of munitions, and then the technological edge. Like, I think in a lot of ways we are quite matched when it comes to drone capabilities, so we use that as much as possible. And then the correction of things like tanks and the Western tanks that we use, their superiority over Russian equipment, trying to basically preserving life in any way we can, and then using that advantage to push the battlefield, not necessarily just relying on numbers. That's how I personally see us winning, because we may lose ground slowly that way, but there is a time when that manpower runs out, and it's not all going to run out at one time, right? Like, it's just like a ticker counting for the Russian sides and we have to get that to zero. No, it's a matter of manpower in strategically valuable areas. So if we can deplete their units that are attacking regions and they send wave in after wave in, eventually that will have to stop in that region. Their supplies run out, their manpower runs out, their equipment runs out, and then there's a halt there, and it gives us a break within that sector, and we focus in other sectors to control the situation there. I mean, you're probably well familiar with what I'm talking about. The Ukrainians have been doing this fantastically throughout the entire war. So that's how I see us, yeah. But when it comes back to your original question of like, how do I see the Russian forces as individual soldiers, I have found that they are, it really depends on the units that you're fighting with. I've seen good displays of like infantry skills and general soldiering skills from Russian soldiers, and then I've seen absolutely atrocious displays of soldiering skills from them as well. It really kind of depends on where you are and what unit you're fighting. I've seen as a theme that you have generally like a group of poorly trained soldiers who are led by one or two more senior soldiers who actually understand what's going on. But I've also seen Russian soldiers essentially abandoned in forward positions because their commanders left them, moved to more safe rear positions. And those soldiers had their supply lines cut. They were constantly bombarded by our drone drops, and eventually they just surrendered because the pressure was too intense on them. So like you were saying about trying to avoid direct contact and forward assaults whenever possible, or frontal assaults, definitely we try to do the same thing. If we can identify that a unit is low morale, low equipment, what's the reason in risking a number of our guys to do a frontal assault on this position when we can just wait them out, right?
Чи бували у вас такі випадки, коли...
Have you ever had cases when Russians understood that they were being stormed by soldiers of the International Legion who speak English there, maybe? By the way, what language do you speak to each other, mostly in combat conditions?
In our combat operations, we primarily speak English. We almost always try to, unless there's some weird situation going on. We always have someone who speaks Ukrainian and English with us. That's mainly for communicating with friendly forces. There's not much that I need to say besides trying to convince a Russian to surrender. That's a helpful one to know. but the opportunities that we've had to speak directly with like enemy Russian combatants has usually been the obvious, like, hey, like, you man, and like just swearing at them. And we've had Russians in some of our past operations. I wasn't there for it personally, but I was told that recently we had some guys on operation and the Russians figured out it was the International Legion, so they were swearing at us in English because the lines were so close together. So they were yelling out stuff about, hey, like, F you Amerikansky and yada yada, which is just pretty wild because I haven't heard of that happening too much. But by the time that we usually get into like verbal distance with these dudes, it's gotten pretty loud by that point, so not a lot of talking. But
Це ж декого так, мабуть, переконує в
This probably reinforces the beliefs of some Russians, particularly those who are ideologically motivated to fight. They seem to believe they're fighting NATO in Ukraine. It might even convince some of them that everyone here is a mercenary, that NATO is fighting this war. That's probably what they think. Tell me, please, as you've also participated in the war in Afghanistan, could you talk about how these wars differ? What roles or functions did you perform as a soldier in Afghanistan? Is the difference really that significant? Although I understand it probably is.
Yeah, so I did just a little bit over, a couple months over a year in Afghanistan, and I don't think that the differences between combat could be any larger in a lot of ways. The operations that we did in Afghanistan mostly revolved around maintaining a presence and then rooting out small groups of enemy within our region. So I was fighting in one of the eastern regions of Afghanistan along the mountain ranges in the province there. And it was an area that had like heavy infiltration routes coming from Pakistan into Afghanistan. So our province saw quite a lot of a significant, like in the spring and the summer, a significant uptick in enemy fighters, what we would call the fighting season in Afghanistan. So during that time, it was mostly just like presence patrols in areas. We also had a significant role during the voting and election during the time I was there. So protecting like the polling stations from enemy attack and stuff was one of the priority missions that we got at that time. It was an interesting time to work, but then our tactics shifted to establishing like combat outposts and living in smaller areas, like outside of the main large FOBs, and working from those to establish security as best we could in the small region around our COP. It was interesting work, but the technological overmatch that we had against the Afghan enemy or like the Taliban or whoever these fighters were, because they came from so many different countries, right? The technological overmatch that we had with that enemy, it was massive, night and day difference. So the relative like peer-on-peer nature of this war makes it a completely different thing, right? And I think it gets brought up in every single interview, but like, there weren't drones in Afghanistan. We had drones, we had Predator drones and stuff, but the enemy didn't have drones. And there certainly weren't FPV drones buzzing around, which are the bane of my existence a lot of the time. So that how far like modern technology has come in terms of war and stuff is massive. This war is I think every 6 months in Ukraine, it evolves into like an entirely new conflict because some new piece of technology has come out and is being utilized on the battlefield. And we have to adapt and change all over again to compensate for that. So yeah, I think that while the basic soldiering skills that I learned in Afghanistan and the discipline that my seniors taught me and the lessons learned from that war, very helpful. But I also think back to how incredibly comfortable and safe I felt in Afghanistan because I knew that we were had the superiority there. I knew that if I got injured, well, you could count on a UH-60 Black Hawk flying in and medevacing you out if you were in somewhere remote or something bad happens. You are going to get taken back to a relatively safe place with higher medical care. There's absolutely no guarantee of that kind of thing happening in Ukraine. As fantastic as our medical chain is within the Legion and how hard those dudes work, there is still the very real possibility that if you get injured, they won't be able to get you for possibly up to 24 hours, if not more. And that's just a reality out here. So that sense of safety and security is pretty non-existent. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because, it keeps your situational awareness up. You don't get complacent in the same way. But that's just a roundabout way of saying that I don't think this war and the Afghan war could be any more different. It's vastly different experiences.
Наступне питання я хотів би в наступному
In my next question, I'd like to address another topic.
Росія багато вкладає
Russia invests heavily in propaganda, including targeting Western audiences.
в тому числі і на західне середовище. І коли
When the interview with John was published, I looked through the comments,
були деякі такі хейтерські.
and there were some hate comments, so to speak. It seems to me that they were written under the influence of this propaganda.
Тому що Росія хоче переконати,
Because Russia wants to convince people that some sort of new Nazi regime is forming in Ukraine, the one that is supposedly very bad. They try to claim that Ukraine wants to take over half the world and portray Zelensky as a second Hitler of the 21st century. So they've decided to strike preemptively, or at least that's their narrative. Some of these comments, written in English, might have been influenced by channels like Russia Today or similar sources. For example, comments like, "There are Nazis fighting there." Have you ever encountered any of these so-called Nazis who are supposedly fighting against civilians and so on?
No, I haven't ever met anyone who is a neo-Nazi, as because I agree wholly with you that is just a narrative that is propaganda pushed by Russia to, stir up the anti-Nazi sentiment in the Western public. I mean, that's a very touchy subject for a lot of Westerners. So it's easy to just be like, oh, that dude's a Nazi, and people are going to get riled up about it because a lot of people don't do their own research and they don't think critically, nor do they exercise their own personal opinion or judgment on things. So they just read one article that's put out by a source. They don't check that source, and they just say, oh, yeah, that sounds interesting. I'm going to believe what that person says without doing any of the necessary homework on where that information is coming from or what it actually means. I don't think it's a very difficult thing for anybody to do their research about the history, even just the recent political history of Ukraine, and see that there is I don't see any historical evidence, even in the past 10, 20 years, of the Ukrainian government having any nefarious goals to take over the rest of the world in any way or push Nazi ideals for any reason. It's just not something that's going on over here. However, I hate to say it, but the Western audience is, and in a lot of ways, especially America, is very isolated and not in touch with what's happening over here. It's most of their interaction with Ukraine is simply through the media, right? So it's very difficult for people to actually comprehend what life is like in Ukraine. They get snippets and then they build their own view picture of what life is like in Ukraine. And that's unfortunate in many ways because they have this false opinion of what's going on over here and what the people are like. But it is a symptom of the West being just quite, like I said, isolated and in its own bubble. It's makes it relatively easy to manipulate people's world views, right, when they themselves haven't traveled and seen this place. If you haven't seen what Ukraine is like, if you haven't talked to Ukrainians and spent time interacting with the people here and actually trying on your end to understand the situation and looking at information from reputable sources, and I'm not talking just what comes out of the news, right? Because in one way or another, a lot of news is biased. But look at things like the Institute of Modern Warfare, or journalists who have a track record of being independent and unbiased in their views of things, and then make your own judgment about what's going on in Ukraine and what life is really like over here. And I think that that outcome of that would be vastly different as to if you just have everything hand-fed to you from some random source on the internet.
If Americans, British people, or residents of European countries were to ask you, who are Ukrainians, really? How would you describe them? Based on your experience of living in Ukraine over these years, how would you characterize the people here? What makes them different? And how would you describe them?
I would say that Ukrainians are very similar. I was amazed when I came over to Ukraine with my limited understanding. You know, I just like anybody else had preconceived notions of what it was going to be like in Ukraine when I came here. I had this idea in my head of what it was going to be like. And I crossed that border in Poland and stepped out of the van in Lviv, and, you know, it was very different than what I pictured. I think that Ukraine is a very modern European country. So much like I draw massive parallels even where I come from in the United States. My city isn't as large as Kyiv by any means, and not nearly as modern in a lot of ways. And then if you go out into some of the rural areas, just like where I lived, you have people who live more of like a slower country life, right? But the same thing in America. Like I've lived within the city, and then I also lived out in like farming communities, and it's so similar to Ukraine. I love going out into some of the more rural parts of the oblasts and seeing these small villages because it is very familiar. Is there differences? Absolutely. But as there is with any country, right? Like it's just different culturalisms. But I think that overall, the Ukrainian people are incredibly hospitable. They are incredibly educated and intelligent. I haven't met so many people who value keeping up on like the current news, and that might just be because there's a war going on in their country, and that makes sense. But like, who devote themselves to being educated and understanding the situation. And like I was talking about before, Ukrainians seem to really, it matters to them to have their own opinion and know what they're talking about. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to repeat the rhetoric of what this guy said. No, they're going to do their homework, and they're going to make sure they understand a topic before they get into a discussion about it. And they're not afraid to tell someone, hey, you don't know what you're talking about on this. A lot of pride and a lot of passion, and a lot of love for their country, which has allowed them to do fantastic things. But I think if anyone thinks that Ukraine is like not a up-to-date, technologically advanced country or something like that, like you got it completely wrong, because you should look at the tech sector that's going on in Ukraine. You should look at some of the things that are coming out and being produced, be it like software engineering and things, how fantastic the Ukrainian people have done with like keeping up with the demand for drones, for example, has been done like almost entirely in-house at this point. And the development of it is like new things are being developed, not in a matter of months or like quarters or anything. It's in like a matter of days or weeks that if someone says, hey, I need this piece of technology or this adaptation for drones, it's getting done almost immediately and then getting employed on the front line, which is something that I don't even think the American military sector can claim is happening with theirs. So I think people have a very different, especially Westerners and Americans, have a different view, and I would urge people to re-educate themselves on that view.
You know, it's really an interesting thought, and especially you mentioned the development of technology. I would like to mention FPV drones, how they have revolutionized the war, and in fact, it's an invention of one of the Ukrainian units. Once they took the technology which allowed for making a cool video, because it's a beautiful dynamic video which can be made with an FPV drone, and they thought, what if we attach ammunition to it, and we will make it, in fact, an amazing ammunition. We will make a weapon out of it.
фактично, що найцікавіше,
Actually, what's most interesting is that, with a few $100s worth FPV drone, they managed to destroy expensive Russian technology, which costs hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions.
І реально це все відбувається в якихось таких хаотичних, але дуже таких волюнтаристських.
And all this is really going on in some chaotic but very voluntary and interesting conditions.
Я насправді певний.
In fact, I am proud of my people and all those people who help us in this.
Тим людям, які йому допомагають насправді в цьому.
By the way, you mentioned how you came to Ukraine through Poland and visited Lviv. Was it difficult for you to join your unit of International Legion of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine? What did it require from you?
I came into Ukraine with an organization at the time that was just assisting volunteers with like getting on their feet as they came across the border. It was relatively early days still, so it was not such an established pipeline for new recruits coming in. I spent a little bit of time in Lviv trying to figure out where I was going to go. Then I went and did a training opportunity, educating a TDF battalion down in Odessa. That was interesting. It wasn't work that I was particularly suited for at the time because I felt like I could probably learn a lot more from those dudes because some of them had actually like spent time at the front at that point, and I certainly hadn't. It was like mid-22 at that point, so I hadn't gone to the front yet, and I was like, okay, how am I supposed, like, yeah, I can teach them the Western concepts of infantry and whatnot, no problem. And the dudes were incredibly receptive, like, massive respect for them on that part because, like I said, I hadn't deployed. So what reason did these dudes who had come back from a rotation on the front and had seen fighting against the Russians, like, what reason did they have to listen to me? And then from doing that, I moved on to the Legion. I got into the Legion not just because I knew people, but I had the right skill sets. I did a few interviews with people, and I guess I made a good enough impression that I got invited to join a team. And then from there, I just didn't really look back. At that time, our recruitment process isn't quite as rigorous as it is now. We are a lot more, we look a bit more intently at people's paperwork and resume, their background now, make sure that they are who they say they are, and if they have military experience, that they can prove that through records and whatnot. And I sent all of that same information to the dude who recruited me because it's what I expected someone would ask, right? Like, okay, I should assume this dude wants me to prove that I was in the military, so here you go. But the process itself for me was just, hey, go to Kyiv, you're going to do the paperwork, you're going to get your military documents, and then you'll head out from there I went to Kramatorsk at that time. And within a couple days, I landed in Kramatorsk and started working.
Just a few hours before the interview, I watched a video from Kyiv where you were awarded the Order of Bohdan Khmelnytsky, 3rd class, by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Could you tell us what it was for, and maybe share what you felt at that moment?
So I received the Order of Bohdan Khmelnytsky for operations conducted in Kherson counteroffensive. I was the alternate team leader, or 2IC for a team at that time. We conducted a raid on a small village that had Russian positions in it. This raid was conducted with the intent of opening up a land bridge across a river. So we did an amphibious raid. We swam boats down. Myself and another team leader the night before swam down this river. Just the two of us reconnoitered the Russian forward positions, made sure their OPs were where we thought they were, made sure if we could actually like travel this river, and then we swam back. And then over the next couple of days, we took boats in, raided those positions. I think we captured 7 Luhansk People's Republic fighters, then took those prisoners back and continued to push into the village and it was the Russians had quite a substantial battle group stationed nearby. They attempted to push into the village, but just got absolutely smashed by HIMARS and other artillery platforms that we had stationed nearby. So unfortunately, I don't know what specific actions it was that I got the Order of Bohdan Khmelnytsky for during that operation, but I know it was that specific operation.
Do you happen to know the history of this order and who exactly Bohdan Khmelnytsky was? Have you looked into it, perhaps?
I have through like the Wikipedia. Like I understand that he was a hetman, correct? And I think one of the longest serving hetmans, super famous one throughout Ukrainian history, of what the order of the Zaporizhian Cossacks. But yeah.
By the way, an interesting historical note came to my mind. In the Cossack army, foreigners were often present as well. For example, one of the colonels in Bohdan Khmelnytsky's army, a very famous figure, is commemorated in many folk songs, including some modern ones, and his name was Maxim Krivonis. A legend goes that he might have come from Scotland, actually.
Oh, cool.
This is a fascinating detail, as foreigners have historically been present in this region alongside us for centuries, even several hundred years ago. Also, I wanted to ask, in one of the videos about reconnaissance, you mentioned how your mother reacted to a particular award you received. You said, if I'm not mistaken, that she wept and felt proud. Could you tell us more about her reaction to this? How do your family and friends, perhaps those in America, feel about your decision? And do they keep in touch or support you in any way?
Yeah, I regularly talk to my family. Probably not, if you ask them, they'd say not as much as I should, but I try my best. And they're incredibly proud now. I think they were, I know for a fact that they were quite nervous when I first came over here. They had I think a lot of, when the war first started, it was, no one in the West was entirely sure how this was going to go. Was it going to be just a 3-day war like Russia claimed, or was it going to be a much longer, drawn-out thing? It was not really sure, especially not for civilians who have no experience in the military world. Like, war is a really, like, confusing thing for people who have no experience with it, right? So my parents were very, very nervous at first for me to come over here when I started talking about it. And when I was more insistent that, like, no, I feel like this is something that I need to do. Like, I can make a difference here and I can do some good work. They became supportive as time went on. Well, I don't want to say that they weren't supportive from the beginning, because they were. They were just nervous at the same time, right? As any parent would be. But they know me, they know how I am, and that once I get an idea in my head, I'm going to go for it. So they might as well just support me as best they can. And then now that they have seen how well I've done over here, it's not so much about like the success or the awards, it's just that they've seen how I've developed as a person. And I do want to say that, like, my time in Ukraine has made me a much better person. I feel more focused. Like, this is having the opportunity that I've been given in Ukraine has really given me, like, direction a lot more. This is something that I feel like I put my whole being behind. Supporting Ukraine is something that it's just an easy decision for me. So it's the things that might have been, like, harder to do, like, oh, do I want to go do PT in America? Because what for? No, it's easy. I want to be the best possible soldier that I can in Ukraine, to help Ukraine as much as possible, and to help the soldiers that I work with as much as possible be reliable. And so I think that they are very proud to see me moving in that direction, and very supportive. Still nervous, but yeah.
Cool. Isn't it compelling what you say, that these events, this war, and your participation in it have made you a better person? Why do you think that is? Because even in Ukraine, there are people who are truly afraid, and I completely understand that. Fear is a completely normal emotion when it comes to war, given the risk of death. Often, it's also fear of the unknown. But you're saying that despite this fear, despite the very real and significant risks, this experience has made you a better person. How so?
I think, so coming from America, in a lot of ways, life is very safe there. Like, America is a relatively isolated country. It has no, like, massive obvious threats. There are no bordering neighbors to it that a war is likely going to break out with in the next few years. So people in America, in a lot of ways, you can get too comfortable there, yeah. You can, and begin to generate problems for yourself because you're so comfortable and there's this sense of safety. And for me, coming from the military and the experiences that I had in the military and just the life that I sought, that's a really, that sense of safety all the time and that comfort is a really dangerous place for me to be because I just get very bored and I get very directionless. It's not I don't fit in so well in that kind of society in a lot of ways. However, when like I said earlier, seeing what was going on in Ukraine, knowing that I could be of benefit here, okay, I'm never going to say that war is a good thing. It's atrocious and it's horrible, the things that people have to do and they do to each other during war. We would all be much better off without it. However, it's a reality that we're forced to live with. It is something, so let's accept it. It might not be a permanent thing by any means, but for the time being, this is what we're dealing with. And for myself, war, sure, yeah, war is absolutely terrifying, but at the same time, and there's parts of the job that I don't like, but at the same time, it is, if I don't do the work to make myself a good soldier, if I am lazy when it comes to doing physical training, if I'm lazy when it comes to doing skills training, if I'm ignoring admin work even and tasks like that, paperwork stuff and making sure that my dudes are tracked and where they're supposed to be and doing their jobs, then that puts people's lives at risk. And that's not acceptable for me. I'm not going to risk somebody else's life because of my laziness or ineptitude. And that's an easy thing to be motivated by, right? And I want to do a good job over here. I want to represent foreigners well. I want Ukrainians, to other military Ukrainian guys or soldiers, or even just the civilians and organizations we work with. I want them to see myself, and I want them to see the dudes that I work with and be like, wow, okay, these are Westerners, and this is the professionalism and the skills they bring to the table. And that's important for me, that we are setting a good example and that they are proud of us being here. Not that they're like, oh, here come the Westerners again, causing issues, getting drunk, fighting with people. That's not helpful. I want them to be supportive of us as well, see us as a benefit to Ukraine. So it makes it, all of that stuff combined makes it really easy for me to do the work and be proud of the work that we're doing. It's scary sometimes, sure, but if I can be doing the job and it helps in some way, and maybe that frees up the slot for somebody else who is, say, I don't know, they continue their life as normal. If I can take that place, because like I said in the beginning, this is what I do for a career. This is what I see myself doing for as long as possible throughout my life. And I would like to continue doing it for Ukraine. So if I can take the spot, that's a pre-made decision for me, right? I'm going to do this work. So maybe I can take the position in the line of someone else who was going to school or something to be a doctor or whatever, and they're going to help the cause in a different way. Rather than making that guy pick up arms and go to the front, I can take that dude's place and be of benefit. All of that stuff combined is just the horrors of war are diminished when you think about it like that, I guess.
Круто.
Cool.
Можеш розказати ще також про підрозділи?
Could you also tell us about the units of the Ukrainian armed forces you've had the chance to work with?
Може, згадаєш?
Maybe you can recall some that stood out to you in some way?
Yeah. So we've worked a bit with, I guess those are actually GUR units, I was about to say, because we've worked extensively with like Kraken and Hartia, but I believe those are GUR units at the same time still. I've worked a bit with dudes from the 73rd Naval SSO, fantastic soldiers. Those guys are really, really cool. Yeah, won't go into any details on the operations that we've done together, but those guys are really, really good dudes. They know who they are. And then we have worked with quite a few different units, well, tons of different units, honestly. I can't remember the names of them off the top of my head. There's been so many, but we've worked with some really good units, like down around Robotny. We worked with some pretty good units down there. Around Bakhmut, we were often slotted in with Ukrainian military units. It's definitely like sometimes you see dudes who are out there and it's like, okay, you are just holding this position, but you're here. So, you know, kudos to those guys. They're doing a good job. And then I've met dudes who are just like, have really taken to soldiering. They might have been doing, I always ask guys, it's one of the first questions I ask dudes when I hop in a trench or a blindage with guys. I'm like, hey, like, what did you do before the war? And some of them were like, oh, I was in the military already. Or they're like, you hear some crazy, I was a baker. Or like, I made bread for a living. That's crazy. And now you're here. Look at us. Like, yeah, it's, but those dudes, regardless of what they did in their previous life, sometimes they are the most fantastic soldiers that I've met. Like, they put dudes in the Western military to shame, be it their ability to move through the woods without being noticed, or like point out things like mines that I'm like, man, I never even saw that. How did you know that was there? Or their reactions when it comes to enemy actions, like dudes just not. They're like, oh, it's normala. When you get the artillery coming in and stuff, it's no problem. These dudes just don't mind it. So yeah, I'm proud to serve alongside those guys. They do. They should make Ukrainians proud too.
Yes, indeed, many people had to completely change their line of work. In 2022, when it all began, there were huge lines of people at the military enlistment offices, TCCs and SPs, as they wanted to voluntarily join the armed forces. What's even more interesting is that many people even concealed their health issues, trying to get accepted in any way, to receive a weapon and to defend their country. It was truly remarkable. Some were bakers, some were doctors, some were firefighters, and everyone, it seems, had and still has a role to play. Have you encountered any language barriers when communicating with Ukrainian soldiers?
Yeah. The language barrier is a big one still. I have done a poor job of learning as much Ukrainian as I should. For the amount of time that I've spent here, I should be able to speak a lot more than I do. But I do believe it is one of the most important things that as a Westerner coming to Ukraine that we can do. Like, you should, before you even come to Ukraine, if you intend to, just start hammering out that Ukrainian language study, because it's, there have been, I believe, like recent legislation changes in the laws to make English the second language of Ukraine, especially for like government employees and stuff. And that's fantastic. But if you're a Westerner and you're going to come to Ukraine, the onus is on you to, or the weight, the burden is on you to learn Ukrainian so you can speak to the people here. Because I guarantee you're going to meet people, especially out in the East, who do not speak English and they have no idea what you're talking about. And hand signals and stuff only get you so far. Through our work with the military specifically, I think that there is enough common language that, like, if a dude, screams at you and is pointing at the ground, you should probably get down. But, or like, that's a pretty good, like, okay, I'm seeing something. There's a lot of like hand signals and gestures that dudes understand, and a lot of very, very basic Ukrainian that we've picked up through our travels, or all of the dudes have, myself included, that helps us a lot in the trenches. But, it can always be improved, absolutely. And I think some of the dudes who are the most successful over here when it comes to Westerners are those guys who have embraced the language and tried really hard to integrate themselves in Ukrainian culture and life. Those guys always really go far.
Але знаєш, я так думаю, Все-таки в Україні справді багато людей вчить англійську мову.
You know, I think that in Ukraine a lot of people really do study English. It's taught in schools.
Обов'язково, можна сказати. В більшість шкіл, якщо потрапити, то там обов'язково предмет
It's
англійської
practically
мови.
mandatory.
На це ставиться
If you go to most
це.
schools, English is a required subject now, and there's a big emphasis on it.
Важливо для офіцерів, в тому числі.
It's also very important for officers.
Зараз були прийняті певні зміни, щоб
In fact, some recent changes have been made so that after the war ends,
часу, коли
there will be a certain transition period, if I'm not mistaken, about 4 years,
матимуть ще час.
during which officers will have time to learn English as well. This will make things much easier overall.
Тому це такий, можна сказати, взаємний
So it's kind of a
процес.
mutual
Чесно,
process.
я зараз
But
народився
honestly,
в цьому
since I was
середовищі.
born into this environment,
Українська це
Ukrainian
мова
is the language of my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents.
Як
I
англомовні
understand it
українці
fully,
українську, мені здається, це
but for an
дуже
English-speaking
складно.
person
У нас
to learn
дуже
Ukrainian, I think it's really
форм,
challenging.
відмінків.
We have so many grammatical
Я
forms,
насправді
declensions,
не знаю.
and cases.
Справді.
Honestly, I don't envy you. So, as I understand, you want to learn Ukrainian.
Yeah, I do. I try to do daily Ukrainian language study of some kind, and my girlfriend is Ukrainian and speaks Ukrainian really, really well. She speaks English really, really well too, luckily for me. But so she's helped me out with a lot of stuff. I kind of have my at-home tutor that I can go and ask any questions. But it is really, really important to me that I learn Ukrainian because it's been too often that you feel a separation from the society when you can only speak English or like a little bit. Man, like I can order a cappuccino at the coffee place, fantastic. But there's so much, I can't ask that person how their day's going or, like any other specifics about anything. So it really limits you. And I'm not here just to I want to do more than just exist. I want to integrate myself in Ukrainian culture and society. And I want to be of benefit to the military as well. And I can only really do that if I speak Ukrainian. I can't set the example for other Westerners, and I can't live up to my full potential if I can't communicate with the people around me. So yeah, it's really important to me that I pick up on that.
А з дівчиною ти
You
познайомився
met the girl when you arrived in Ukraine, right?
Так.
Так?
Cool.
Можеш декілька
Can
слів?
you say a few words?
Yeah. She's fantastic. Her name's Margot. She's from Kherson. And her whole family is from Kherson. So she's lived in Kyiv for a bit now. We had a lot of connection over the fact that I did some work down there. And, there's that bond. So it's hard for her to see everything that's going on in her home right now. Understandably so. It's a difficult time down there, and it has been throughout the entire war. But she is an incredible woman, very strong, very supportive. I would not have been able to achieve many of the things that I have in Ukraine or live as comfortably as I do here without her help. I mean, she's really something else, so yeah.
Слухай, я
Listen,
страшенно
I'm
радий.
so incredibly happy for you two that you met.
Дуже кльово.
That's really awesome.
Дуже гарно
You
про неї
speak so
відгукуєшся.
highly of her,
Дуже
and
радий.
I'm genuinely very happy for you.
Ще
I also
хотів
wanted to
запитати.
ask this.
Я, наскільки знаю,
As far as I know,
також
you first learned
там
about
вперше
Ukraine,
дізнався
or
про
at least
Україну,
became aware of
коли
it,
грав в
through video
відеоігри,
games,
і в
including
тому числі
S.T.A.L.K.E.R.
Чи
Have you had the
вдалося
chance to
пограти
play
в
the
другу
second part of
частину
S.T.A.L.K.E.R.
S.T.A.L.K.E.R?
yet? Maybe you could share your thoughts on it, or if not, perhaps talk about your experience with the first part.
Yeah, the S.T.A.L.K.E.R. series is something that's very near and dear to me. I love the lore surrounding it, the stories that came out of it when when S.T.A.L.K.E.R. was first being released or developed, the initial one. They had this opportunity for people to write short stories about it, like fan fiction about the S.T.A.L.K.E.R. world, and the GSC would post it on their forums, and you could just go read this, and I would spend hours reading through all these different stories that people had written about what happened in Chernobyl and the zone and stuff, and it was amazing. And I think that that really did, at that time in my life, like develop this passion for Eastern European culture and like style and stuff. Really, that stuck with me through my entire life. Big S.T.A.L.K.E.R fan now, and that because of my exposure to that. So, and then, yeah, I have had the opportunity to play the S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 game. I was deployed when it came out, and so I didn't get to mess with it as much as I would have liked when it first came out. But now that I've been able to come back to Kyiv, I've had the opportunity to play it more, and I'm loving it. It's fantastic.
Круто.
Cool.
Я насправді дуже тішусь, що
I'm really happy that we can make games like this in Ukraine, and that people really like it in any part of the world.
Я сподіваюся, що
And I hope that the time will come when S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 will be released on PlayStation. Because I have a PlayStation and I still can't play it.
Можливості на ній пограти. Зате, знаєш, я граю в одну американську, ну, як
But, you know, I'm playing an American game.
Можливо, я фанат.
I'm a fan, so to speak, and I like it the most. It's Red Dead Redemption 2.
Yeah.
Та, і якось так. Там про Україну, тут про...
The one is about Ukraine, another is about the USA. I really like this game.
Теж, скажи...
We've traded histories.
Є. Та, це кльово дуже, справді.
Yeah, yes, it's really cool.
Скажи, чи є в тебе якісь плани на...
Do you have any plans after the war? If the war ends, do you plan to return to the United States or stay in Ukraine?
I'd like to stay here in Ukraine. In my previous civilian life in America, I was really enjoyed like gardening and farming, and I would like to continue to do that. I really like living out in like nature and a bit away from the city. So ideally, I would like to get like a small like dacha somewhere or a small farm in a more rural community in Ukraine, probably down in the south towards Kherson in that region. And I would really like to have a garden again and grow some vegetables and have some chickens and stuff. I really miss that about my life in America. I spent a lot of time like out in the woods, hiking. I'm a really big mountain biking enthusiast. So just spending more time in nature and doing that kind of stuff. My girlfriend always encourages me to write a book about my time here. So maybe after the war, I'll find some time to do something like that. But yeah, I very much plan on staying. And then a part of staying too is to continue to develop my career with the Ukrainian military, to be of an asset to them. We've done some really amazing things in the Legion, like the development of the Legion, and I'm really committed to seeing, after we win this war, seeing what kind of unit we can continue to turn that into. And if we can, if the Ukrainian government sees fit, then maybe we can continue to bring Westerners over here to be of service in the Ukrainian military. That's something I'm really passionate about. And yeah, so trying to continue to help develop that would be cool.
Знаєш, хочу тобі
You know,
дуже
I'd like to tell you that I really appreciate this talk.
Ти сказав, що хочеш вивчити...
You say you want to learn Ukrainian very much.
Дуже сильно. Я обіцяю, що насправді я...
I'm going to start speaking in English
щоб ми, можливо, так якби також втратили цей, можливо...
so that we could break our language barrier.
Але дякуючи нашому перекладачу...
But thanks to our interpreter, we were able to talk. It was a very pleasant experience for me.
І хочу закликати...
And I'd like to invite people who are watching us to share this video wherever they are, whether in the United States or in Ukraine,
більше людей дізнавалось про те,
so that more people get to know what it's really like here,
це війна з перших уст, а не
how this war looks from first-hand accounts,
чи від російської
and
пропаганди,
not from some Russian propaganda.
тому що дуже важливо знати з перших уст,
Because it's very important to know how and what is happening.
Я зичу максимально Міжнародному легіону успіхів і дякую.
I wish the International Legion the best of luck. And I thank each and every one for your work because it's very important. It's a huge contribution to the future of not just Ukraine, but the whole world. So thank you very much.
Дуже дякую. We're done. Thanks.